Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. I'm Arisha Hatch, Vice President and Chief of Campaigns at Color of Change, and I'm here today to discuss tech accountability and racial equity with some of the leading voices in that field. I am so excited to be joined by Aerica Shimizu Banks and Bärí Williams, who are both innovative leaders in the technology industry. Aerica is co-founder of Beacon, the DC Women Founder Initiative, and founder of Shimizu, a consultancy rooted in social impact and racial justice. A former policy analyst at Google and social impact manager at Pinterest, Aerica has experienced the racial inequities rooted in tech corporations firsthand and is a testament to the complexities of Black women leadership in tech. Bärí is the Chief Operating Officer at Bandwagon Fan Club, a data and identity analytics tech company specializing in sports and entertainment. Prior to Bandwagon, she was lead counsel at Facebook, supporting internet.org connectivity efforts. Bärí has served as VP of Policy Affairs at All Turtles, an AI startup studio, and former head of business operations for North America at StubHub. Her book, Diversity in the Workplace, Eye-Opening Interviews to Jumpstart Conversations About Identity, Privilege, and Bias, was released in March 2020. Aerica and Bärí, it is great to have you both joining us. I'd love to start out by just sort of asking a little bit about your story. How did you both get into the tech industry? And how has your experience been working at big tech corporations like Google and Facebook? I'd love to start with you, Aerica, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Arisha and Color of Change. It's been an honor working with you all. My story in tech actually begins as an accident. It begins with the government shutdown of 2013. So ever since I was a kid, I knew or thought I knew that I wanted to be an environmental lawyer, working to conserve the trees, etc. Because honestly, as a mixed kid growing up in California, whose father is Black and whose mother is Japanese, I was taught at a very early age, and I think this is true for many in my generation of elder millennial, that focusing on civil rights, focusing on Black issues would be a pigeonhole and would limit my career. And I knew I wanted to work in public service. I knew I wanted to work for the public good. And so I thought that working for the environment would be a nice middle ground. When I got to college, I learned about environmental justice and the interconnected intrinsic link between environmental degradation and racism in the form of housing injustice, public health inequities, the terrible rates of asthma and cancer that affect our communities because we are forced to live near toxic waste sites, etc. When I made that connection, I knew actually there's no other way to serve the public unless I have this civil rights view. So I dedicated myself to policy. I worked at the Obama White House in public policy at the Office of Management and Budget and Environmental Policy, and went to Oxford for my master's degree. It was only a year-long master's, so I thought my spot would be waiting for me when I get back. But lo and behold, the month I turned in my dissertation, we went into a government shutdown and I had to find a plan B. I applied to maybe 70 environmental organizations. The only company that would hire me was Google in the US. So I ended up at Google and tried to apply that lens, that same lens of public service, of seeing things interconnectedly and intersectionally when it comes to race and gender and all of the other things that should not oppress us but do. And I brought that lens to tech to mixed results. Sometimes it was praised, and other times, as you may have now heard in the news, it was vilified. And so that is now, those are all of the lenses and experiences I bring to my work today.
Thank you so much, Aerica. And Bärí, how about you? How did you get into tech, and how has your experience working at big tech? How has your experience been in that space?
How did I get into tech? To Aerica's point, what she was talking about, particularly around environmental justice. My dad grew up in North Richmond. And if anybody is familiar with California, North Richmond is literally across railroad tracks and next to refineries. So lots of the people there have asthma. Um, there's food insecurity because there are no grocery stores that are actually nearby. And there's no public transit that you could actually take. So he had literally a computer store in the 80s and 90s. And so I just was around computers. And he also was a sports agent. So I was completely raised around sports as well. Um, but that was fundamental to me when I was at Facebook, because I was at Facebook and I was in legal. And that's what made me do the supplier diversity program, is because watching him, he always would complain about, like, he would get to the end of trying to close a deal or a large deal with a company. And they're like, oh, we're going to go this way. And that way was never a Black or brown person. So that's what made me interested and it was in being a lawyer. Um, and yeah, but Erica's other point about being Black in tech, and you talk about Black issues and you get pigeonholed. I honestly, my mom always, the first thing that my mom says, and I think that's just because of their generation, is, okay, you're saying this, but are you going to get in trouble? And I was like, I don't care. What are they going to do? So, and also, I feel like I was raised around that. My mom was part of a group of people, the people who started the Oratorical Festival in Oakland Unified, and that was a whole HBO documentary this year. And so I don't know anything different. I don't know how to not just shut up and dribble. So, and I never will.
Mhm.
And I tell my kids, don't do that either. Like, if you see something, say something. If somebody is treating you poorly, say that.
Mhm. Well, you both are definitely working very hard to shift the industry. Um, I sort of grew up adjacent to Silicon Valley. I went to college at Stanford. All my friends ended up working at Facebook around that time. It was sort of like a company, like, you know,
I'm not going to hold that against you.
yeah. But it was sort of like going to work for Ford, and you like grew up and and I as I got more into racial justice work, as we saw the continued rise of this sort of big tech space, and at first I was only looking at diversity, but then I started, as we talked to more people who were on the front lines working in these companies, friends that I really trusted, who I felt like had the right intentions. I started to realize that there was so much more going on below the surface of just diversity, that like real damaging impacts to Black people, other people of color, other poor people, not only in this country, but across the globe. Everybody's sort of being impacted by this space. Aerica, your experience came to the forefront of conversation during the wave of corporate pledges to support racial justice in 2020, during the summer, during the uprisings, while you were working at Pinterest. How has your experience been since then in pioneering racial equity within the tech industry?
So I ended up coming forward about what I experienced at Pinterest alongside Ifoma Azoma, who I worked with at Google, and then who recruited me actually to Pinterest. And we decided to come forward because literally like a thief in the night, Pinterest dropped a statement in support of Black Lives Matter, talking about how they were going to reallocate resources to address racial justice, when I had known for the past year I'd been in a battle for my mental health, for my livelihood, because of my Blackness, and specifically because of my Black womanness. And even in speaking today, I run the risk of being sued perhaps by the company for speaking out about my experience, because currently in the state of California, it is legal to share your experiences of sexual harassment or gender-based discrimination in the wake of Me Too, but not your experience of any other form of harassment. And so I take that risk because, in addition to advocating for the Silence No More Act, which would empower victims of all sorts of discrimination at the workplace to speak out, um, the hypocrisy of these companies has to be called out. And knowing from the inside that so often these declarations, even beyond this moment of uprising that occurred in 2020, that of course comes after the uprisings of 2014 and 2012 and 2016. These moments have always been met by statements. And I'll never forget, even at Google, how momentous it felt when the company tweeted Black Lives Matter, and how much conversation that generated. Words have power, but when you take words and money and action, they're just words. And it's time for the money and it's time for the action to follow through. And so I speak out for that. And ever since then, I've been able to take the skills that I've learned through lobbying ever since I was a teenager, lobbying for diversity at my high school, for the plants and trees not to be demolished in my neighborhood, in the real estate bubble of 2008, to getting my first legislative language into Washington state regulations when I was a student at Seattle University, to advancing bills for Google on patent issues, and then representing Pinterest to our U.S. Congress people. I feel so grateful that I can take those skills to now work for my people. And in working for my people and Black people, really, we are working for the liberation of all, because oppression of anyone isn't, injustice against anyone is injustice for everyone. And so it's truly an honor to be able to take these experiences, and not just the hardship of that, but the real skills and the platform that has been given me in this situation to hopefully do some good. And so I never want to claim the title of activist, because there's blood on the line in that. And there's the power of the grassroots behind that. And I have so many relative privileges that have given me this platform in a relatively short amount of time. But I am an advocate, and that I get to work for this. And some people pay me to do this work, but also that people just will listen to me because of this platform. It's an honor.
Thank you. And we'll come back to you in a second, Bärí, but I'd love to just sort of following up on that. Or maybe let's go to let's go to Bärí first on this. How do you think tech companies have failed to take the sufficient steps to relieve, their own faults on issues like racially biased advertisements, retaliatory working environments, or complicity in the spread of white nationalist rhetoric on their platforms? What sort of lens can you sort of add to that?
I think and again, forgive me for my voice, but I think to Erica's point of, there are statements, and then there's money, and then there's action. And the very most simplest way I could put it is something that my grandmother always taught me. Was she just would always say the phrase, "Watch people's feet." Their mouths will move, but are their feet moving? So that is the same thing. Like, watch their feet. And if they're not really doing anything, like, it's very easy to talk to your diversity director and the person who runs comms and come up with a cute statement and put that out, and then do nothing after that. So that, to me, is what I really want to see, particularly the most. And my Fast Company editor is probably going to hate me because I need to finish writing something for her tomorrow. But it's literally about that. Like, okay, you all did all these statements and whatnot around July and August after everything happened during the summer. but we haven't gotten an update. So yes, you're going to give X amount of dollars to Black founders, and you're going to give X amount of dollars and invest with diverse suppliers. Okay, so tell us what happened, because it's been a year. It's almost been a year. And not just that, but what have you actually done to, like, all these companies, particularly in Georgia, that pulled out and because of their voting restriction laws? And what have you all done to lobby to get the George Floyd bill passed? Like, where's all of that? So again, that's nice and it's cute that you want to write 3 paragraphs and say you think we're nice and you care about us, but you're not actually putting your money to work for that or doing anything to demonstrate it.
Mhm. And I think that's just been so frustrating for me as an organizer, as someone that's an activist pushing for more corporate accountability. Last summer, in the aftermath of, and it wasn't just George Floyd, it was Ahmaud Arbery, it was Breonna Taylor, and so many others who um, have not been named, who will never be sort of named, that pushed people into the streets in the middle of a pandemic. It was so upsetting to folks that they like went to the streets, risked their health in the middle of a pandemic. And I remember at the time feeling like, and talking to older Black activists who like watched as all these corporations put out these Black Lives Matter statements and started to make these like commitments that we're not sure if they followed up on. And at the time, it did feel like this sea change, like this is not something that we've sort of seen before. But I think my frustration and the frustration of so many others has
It
been.
is, and I hate to just even stop you, but I can tell you, as the mother of a Black boy, he saw George Zimmerman get off. He will be 11 in July, and he saw George Zimmerman get off. He saw Freddie Gray. He saw he's seen everything, and he even said last year when he saw the protest, and he was like, I don't understand why we still have to do this.
Mhm, mhm,
And I
mhm.
said, well, what do you mean? And he was like, didn't grandma already do this? Like, so why are we still doing it?
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
And it's like, I wish I had an answer for you, but I don't know why we still have to do it, but we do.
Bari, you're a strong believer in diversity gets people in the door and inclusion keeps them there. How are the diversity practices in big tech different from the inclusion practices needing for tackling racial justice issues in your mind?
Um, I will say that in my experience, sometimes diversity directors are just figureheads, and sometimes they actually do the work. And my thing has always been, I haven't seen you before. Like, I haven't seen you in the community in doing the work in your own community. So how are you actually going to also do this for veterans and LGBTQ and women and other minorities? Because I don't see you anywhere around. So I always first say, like, well, look at, if your diversity director, if nobody knows that person, that's kind of exhibit A. It means that you just needed to put somebody in a spot, and that's what you did. And also, the thing that I remind people is, when you look at diversity directors, look how far down they are from the CEO. Because if they're buried 8 levels deep in HR, that isn't going to get anything done.
No, I think that's so right. And just to stick with you for a second, why, as you think about the present moment that we're in, why is accountability for tech companies so important?
I know people say it sometimes, particularly on Twitter, as a joke. It's like, oh, I want to call in Black today. But some days you really just need to. And I think that the accountability piece is like, you aren't considering that, some of your employees really just can't concentrate today because they're thinking about this. And you haven't even considered it because you could just walk through the world and it just doesn't occur to you. So that's why the accountability matters, because it's not just an issue around, actually walking the talk, but it's how do you actually really, really make an inclusive environment?
If I can add to that, Thandiwe Newton gave an interview in Vogue magazine recently where she said, why is diversity, or really why is Black representation in the media in my field so important to me? Because when I'm the only one, I become complicit in the oppression of my people. And that is what the tech industry does when they make us into figureheads by selecting us for how we look, to be representatives of an entire group of people. When we're in these policy spaces, when we're in the diversity and inclusion work, when they can say, hey, as in the instance of Pinterest, hey, we're all better now because we selected 2 Black women to our board, or we have a new Black director of diversity, as many organizations do. And like Bärí said, it's like, well, a lot of us in the community have never heard of you, but that's supposed to be sufficient. And we have to move beyond these superficial tokens of representation to true representation. And as we know, even with diversity reporting, even with these statements that have come out, tech numbers of Black employment have remained constantly low since the inception of diversity reporting and since the inception of their companies. I think for most of the big tech companies, it hovers at 3% for Black people. Yet we are close to 15% of the national population. So until we get representation that looks like America, we do not have representation in tech. And all of us in the tech industry are unwittingly and forced to become complicit in this segregation of Black people and all other people who are basically just not white in this industry. So, fighting for accountability is about being honest about the state of things. And until we're honest, we cannot change things. And so it's really a first step of transparency to empower the public to have the tools to compare what is being said with what is actually being done and what should be done. And to all of the metrics that Bärí raised, all of those are in the racial justice equity audit framework that we've created.
Thank you. And I love, Bärí, I know you're going to chime in here, but I love if you could give some thoughts. So we're talking about this like racial equity audit that we want a bunch of tech companies to do. We think it's very, very important to do. And yet I think we all sort of realize for a set of companies, self-regulation isn't going to be the answer to the major solutions. And I know, Bärí, you've provided congressional testimony on racial bias in AI and AI and financial services. What would federal regulation for tech companies look like? And what, in your opinion, is the next step to get there?
Yeah, I think in order to appropriately do that, you can't self-regulate and self-audit. Like that's like, if I tell my son he's on punishment and what do you want? And he's like, well, I'll sit in the corner, but like I would like ice cream and cookies and whatever else while I sit there. That's not going to work. You need somebody else who's actually going to hold you accountable. So I think if we're actually talking about what does real regulation look like, it would be full scale auditing of not just who you have hired, but what is their leveling and what is their career trajectory? Because the other piece to this is like, they want to give these numbers and say, oh yeah, we hired X, Y, and Z number of Black people. And then you actually look at their leveling and they're all, at least for tech companies, you start usually at like level 2 or 3, which means they're all entry level. So none of these people are actually making it to VP status. So that's a problem. And because these companies are so large, they can easily get away with it. It's like, oh, well, everybody can't be a director. We have 100,000 employees. Okay, well, why do you have this 42-year-old man who has been doing this for 18 years at this level? So that is what I would say is like the first step is, and I also look at diversity as a four-legged stool. So I want to see what your employees are, what's their leveling. I want to see who are your suppliers. I want to see who are your board members. That's the piece that people completely just disregard. I would like to see a full scale audit of those three things the most. Um, but yeah, it's like it's not just your, employees, because that's the number that people always look at is like, oh, what's the percentage of this? And I know that people fudge those numbers. I've seen it. Like, you didn't have 6 Black women in leadership at this company. You expanded the definition of leadership in order to get to those 6 people. You added 2 people by expanding the definition. And that's not the definition internally. So, like, don't lie to my face.
And, to that, I think I'm very much a yes and person, in that while we should be advocating for stronger regulation and really just stronger application of existing law that specifically, Black people at the forefront in coalition with many other groups through the civil rights movement got on the books. We should be applying those laws. And we should have an expectation that companies hold themselves to a higher standard than the superficial drivel that they're feeding us. And so, to that, I think one real challenge of this equity audit framework is that many companies will not want to expose themselves to possible liability due to what this framework will expose if they apply it accurately. And these are in the 6 areas that we've identified. Of transparency, workers' rights, civil rights, divestment from police, diversity and belonging, platform impact, and then 13 assessments that we have created in this on internal policy, algorithmic bias and automated decisions, employment agreements, privacy and security, content moderation, contractors and essential business functions, pay inequity, race in the workplace, culture, board performance, organization structure, products and user experience, and civil rights staff. The majority of those topics and the majority of those assessments are in the news right now as potential legislation to be reformed, either through the PRO Act or in the result of Proposition 22 that passed, and what that will account for, in the George Floyd Policing Act. All of these bills that are up for debate now speak to all of these issues that tech needs to be evaluated on. So simultaneously, while the government has a responsibility to enforce laws and strengthen laws that protect civil rights, we should also, as customers, as a public that is sometimes unwittingly influenced by these platforms, by their dominance in the market, by their dominance in popular culture and social media, by their real foundational role in amplifying white nationalist extremism, we have a right to hold these companies to a higher standard as well, in addition to the government.
Thank you so much, Aerica. I think that's so right on. And I too am a yes and person. Like, there are a set of companies that if we're lucky, we know we need to be regulated. They rise to the level of monopoly power. They rise to the level of public utilities. Then there are other set of big tech companies, corporations. I'm not going to name any, but I don't know if Pinterest ever makes it to federal regulation. And we need companies like Pinterest, though, to be thinking about diversity and inclusion in the workplace. We need them to be thinking about the impact of their other practices or their other product on Black people and other marginalized people. And so I just want to appreciate you all for being partners in this work, for being advocates in this work. We know that this is a complex, multifaceted problem. But like, we have to get it right because Black lives are at stake. And for me, what just really resonates, it's not okay for Facebook to put out a Black Lives Matter statement on their account one day, while also enabling a growing white supremacist base that is actually like trying to physically harm Black people in the real world, in real life, offline, making plans and conspiring in that way. And so we have to see those, the things that they're talking about match up with their actions. But I want to thank you both so much for participating in this timely and important conversation. And thank you for all that you continue to do to hold big tech companies accountable for the harm and discrimination they enable in our communities. And before we end, I want to encourage all Color of Change members and all viewers to take action against big tech's overreaching power and hold companies accountable for their practices that actually hurt our communities, to learn about our goals for racial equity in big tech, and sign our petition calling on Google to conduct a racial equity audit. Thank you again, and I will see you all soon.